All right. Well, if you've been here with us over the last several weeks, you know that we have been working our way through the book of Genesis, looking at different figures from the history of the nation of Israel. So we've talked about Abraham, we talked about Isaac, and we've been most lately talking about Jacob. And so this morning, our title is The Deceiver Deceived. And if you want to, you can open your Bibles to page 20. We're looking at chapter 29. I'm going to be skipping around a little bit, or you can just listen. So the last couple weeks, I've been asking you every week 2 different questions. So we're going to see how well you've been paying attention. Who is the individual credited with collecting the stories that make up the book of Genesis? Anybody know? Moses, that's right. And we've talked about the big event that we remember Moses for is what? The Exodus. Okay, so we've got Moses collecting the stories of Genesis and telling them to the nation of Israel as they are traveling out of slavery in Egypt and into the promised land. So Moses is telling the stories of Israel to the people of Israel, and what he's sharing with them is their origin story. He's telling them their history. So what we have been talking about is God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we've talked about there are 3 pieces to this covenant promise. That is the promise of land, the land of Canaan, the promise of many descendants, and the third one is that all peoples on earth will be blessed through this one family. So Moses is telling this origin story to the people of Israel as they are the fulfillment of these promises. They are traveling to the promised land. They are now a huge nation of people, the many descendants, and they are supposed to be a blessing to everyone else in the world. They are supposed to be a blessing to everyone they encounter. So that's the history, just to bring you up to speed. But right now we're talking about Jacob, who is on the run from his brother Esau. He has stolen his brother's birthright for a pot of stew, and he's stolen his brother's blessing by tricking his father. So Jacob, we talked about, is a bit of a schemer. He's a trickster. His name literally means grabber. So Jacob is a person who's constantly trying to grab what is not his. He's trying to grab onto something that God has already promised him, which is a problem, right? God has already promised to bless him, but Jacob keeps trying to manage and manipulate this blessing for himself, even though God has given it to him. So Jacob deceived his brother, tricked him out of his birthright, and Esau was like, I'm going to kill this guy, literally. And so Jacob had to run away. And Jacob's mom told him to flee at once. She found out that Esau was trying to kill Jacob, and she said, flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him for a while until your brother's fury subsides. When your brother is no longer angry with you and forgets what you did to him, I'll send word for you to come back. Okay, so Mom has said this. Jacob is being obedient, and he's running for his life. He goes to Haran, where his extended family, his mother's family, is from, and he's gone there to find a wife. And on the way, Pastor Melissa told us this last week, on the way, God appears to Jacob in a vision and reminds him, I've promised to bless you. I mean, God lays out for him, here are the 3 blessings. I'm going to give you this land, I'm going to give you many descendants, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So God has reminded Jacob of these things, and now in addition, God says to Jacob, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until what I have done, what I have promised you. So that's from 28:15. It's almost like God knew that Jacob needed to know that God was with him. Okay, so that's the background. Jacob has now arrived in Haran, and that brings us up to the beginning of chapter 29. Jacob arrives in Haran, and he goes to the well. You're going to hear a lot of echoes of the story of Isaac and Rebekah in this story, but this is Jacob, his son. So Jacob gets to the well, and when he gets there, all the shepherds have stood around the well. They're waiting. There's a stone over the well, and these shepherds are there with his sheep. And Jacob says, why aren't you guys watering your flocks? And they said, well, we have to wait till everybody gets here because it takes a couple of us to roll this stone off of the well, and then we all water our flocks of sheep at the same time. So Jacob's standing there, he's chatting with the shepherds, and he says, hey, I'm here to see if I can find some members of my mom's family. Do you guys know my Uncle Laban? And they say, yes, we do. In fact, here comes his daughter Rachel now with her sheep. She's going to water her sheep. Now Jacob spies her, and he thinks she looks kind of cute, and he's got this big stone right over the well, and all of these shepherds standing around. So he thinks, I gotta get these shepherds out of here so I can talk to Rachel. So he himself goes over and pushes the stone out of the way from the well by himself. Like he's kind of, what I want you to see is Jacob is a little bit impulsive. He doesn't always think clearly. He just sort of does things. And in this case, he's seen cute girl, big stone, move stone, feed sheep. So all these people will get out of the way so he can talk to Rachel. That's about how much thought he's putting into this. So he has a burst of strength, rolls the stone away, and waters his uncle's sheep. He's kind of showing off. And then he kisses Rachel and starts weeping and says, you belong to my mother's family. And I'm just thinking, poor Rachel. She's like, I'm just here to feed the sheep. I don't know what's happening with this guy. Okay. So then she runs back to tell her family that that Jacob is here, that he belongs to their extended family. He's arrived. And so now there's sort of a family reunion happening. So this brings us to the second point, which is better you than a stranger. So we have meeting at the well, and now better you than a stranger. So Jacob shows up to Laban's house. He's estranged. Remember, his brother wants to kill him, and he's deceived his own father. So his own family, he's kind of the black sheep at this point. But he's arrived with his extended family, and Laban says, you've been staying with us for about a month. Seems like maybe I should pay you for the work that you're doing. Why don't you tell me what I should pay you? And Laban had 2 daughters. So Jacob says, I would like to marry your daughter Rachel. Now Rachel was the younger one, and as Haley read for us, we have this weird thing about Leah, the older one, has weak eyes. I read a lot of commentaries this week. Every single one of them has a different opinion about what is meant by her weak eyes. We don't really know what that means, but for whatever reason, she was less attractive to Jacob than the younger sister. So Jacob wants to marry Rachel. Now, usually, when a family was arranging a marriage, the bride's family would name an amount of money that they needed to marry off their daughter. And so, usually, it's up to a few years' wages. Now, Jacob offers 7 years of wages. This is his idea. He offers 7 years, which is about twice as much as anybody would ever ask. So again, Jacob, impulsive, showing off a little bit. I'll work for 7 years because he really thinks Rachel's cute. And we're told Jacob was so in love with Rachel that this only seemed like a few days to him. And Laban's response to all of this is, it's better that I give her to you than to some other man. I mean, I don't know if this is like a ringing endorsement, but it's sort of like, better you than someone else. And so then Laban agrees to this plan. The other thing that you're meant to see in this text is that Laban tends to be greedy. Like, Laban tends to think almost exclusively in dollar signs. Almost every time his name is introduced, it's connected to some sort of monetary gift. So Laban is always looking for these things. Jacob is offered to work twice as long as what a normal groomsman would offer. So to him, he's like, yeah, I'll do that. That sounds great. He's going to marry off his younger daughter to Jacob because it's better you than some other man. Which brings us to the third point, which is the younger and the older. So Jacob, this is verses 21 through 28. Jacob has now worked for 7 years for Laban. And remember, before Jacob left, his mom said, go visit Uncle Laban for a little while, and then I will let you know when it's safe to come home. But now he's been here for 7 years, which is a lot longer than a little while. So we don't know, has Rebecca sent for him? Has he heard news from home? We have no idea, but he has committed himself to 7 years of labor. And now he's finished that. He's impatient to marry Rachel. And so Laban throws a big party for the wedding, but he substitutes the bride. It's supposed to be Rachel, but he substitutes Leah for Rachel and introduces her to Jacob. Like, a couple cultural pieces, it's important to note, she was probably heavily veiled for her wedding. So Jacob couldn't see her face. So he went through the whole wedding thinking he's marrying Rachel, but it was Leah who was under all the things. And probably because it's a party, Jacob was probably drinking. So it really is true that he probably didn't know who he was married to until the next day, when everything had been finalized and the marriage had been consummated. So when Jacob wakes up, he realizes he's married the wrong girl, and he's not happy about it. We're told that he was angry with Laban because he was tricked. And Laban's answer is, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." Now, if you remember Jacob's backstory, right? He was the younger son. He had tricked his own parents out of his brother's inheritance. He's the younger son. He had stolen the older son's inheritance and blessing. And here he demanded to marry the younger daughter. And Laban's like, hold up, that's not how we do things here. So what you're meant to see is that Jacob had always had a way of scheming, conniving, and tricking his way into getting what he wanted. And it usually wasn't the custom. And here, Uncle Laban just kind of puts a hard stop on that and says, that's not how we do things. I don't care who you are. I don't care how conniving and tricky you are. That's not how we do things. So Jacob is kind of having his first experience of what it's like to be on the other side of this. Okay, so he's angry because the older had been substituted for the younger, and he's angry because he'd been tricked, he felt cheated. The deceiver became the deceived. And I want you to kind of put yourself in Jacob's shoes here. He's used to getting what he wants. And here, it's this moment where he hadn't been able to weasel his way out of something. And so he's experiencing what that feels like. Now, he's arguing with Laban, and Laban says, well, that's not how we do things here. Go ahead and finish this week for Leah, and then I'll give you Rachel. And Jacob now agrees to work another 7 years for the privilege of marrying the woman that he thought he was marrying in the first place. So if you're doing the math, that's 14 years total for 2 wives. And Jacob was only supposed to be gone for a little while. This is now doubled into 14 years. Okay. Now, what you need to know, or what I want to invite you to think about, is what it feels like to be Leah in this scenario. She's the oldest sister. She has weak eyes, whatever that means. But she had not been the one that was sought after for marriage. We don't know if she had any other options for marriage. But here she had her wedding, which is supposed to be this highlight in her life, and her new groom was deeply disappointed to find out that he was married to her, and starts arguing with her dad the very next day and wants, some sort of something better. And not just something better, but her younger sister is what he actually wants. So I want you just to kind of put yourself in her shoes, what that feels like. And now, for the rest of her life, she's going to have to share her husband with her sister. It's a recipe for total disaster. It's a lot of pain. It's potential just total family dysfunction. But this is what her father had arranged for her. So chapters 29 and 30 go on to give us the history of all of the children that Leah, Rachel, and then they each had slaves that were serving their families. And they also served as slave wives to Jacob, and they produced children for Jacob as well. So we've got 4 women producing children for Jacob. Leah has 6 of them. And this was, in Scripture, we're told that this is the way that God is blessing her. God knows that she is unloved, and so God gives her children. Meanwhile, Rachel has a very hard time having children. So she gives her slave to her husband to produce children on her behalf. And then Leah, when she can't have kids anymore, gets jealous and gives her husband her slave to produce children on her behalf. So I want you, again, just entering into this, how this feels in their family dynamic, that he has an unloved wife, Leah, who can produce children. He has a very loved wife who can't have kids at all. And then these two slave women who produce children but don't have the honor of being either a real wife or a real mother because their children are taken from them and raised by the official wives. So there's just a lot going on in this story. Eventually, Rachel does have a child, but it takes a long time. And what I want us to see is that this family, they eventually have 12 sons, but there's a lot of pain. This is not like a happy family. And remember, Moses is telling this story to the Israelites, and every single Israelite hearing this story would have known which of those 4 women was their ancestor. So hundreds of years later, they're going, oh, I'm the descendant of a slave wife, or I'm a descendant of an unloved wife. So again, this is just really fascinating that this is how God tells the story of the nation of Israel. So after, eventually Rachel has one son whose name is Joseph. And Jacob kind of loses his mind because finally his favorite wife produces a son after years of not being able to. So Joseph is his favorite. And after his birth, Jacob wants to go back home to his family in Canaan. So he goes to Laban and says, I want to take my family home. But Laban knows that the only reason he's experiencing any sort of financial success is because of Jacob's presence, because God has blessed Jacob. So Laban is unwilling to let him go. He's had 14 years of labor out of this guy. He's managed to marry off 2 of his daughters, or maybe only daughters, to this man. And so he doesn't want to lose him. So he says to Jacob, he's kind of desperate, what do I need to do to keep you here? And so Jacob comes up with this crazy idea that he will take over any of the speckled, spotted, or dark-colored sheep and goats that are produced out of Laban's flock. I have no idea why this is a thing, but apparently this is a thing. So Laban says, sure, that sounds great. And then Laban goes through his entire flock and picks out any animal that qualifies, any animal that's streaked or spotted or dark-colored, and gives them to his own sons and says, hey, how about you guys head off into the desert about a 3 days journey? So Laban has just gone through his entire holdings, his entire financial wealth, and eliminated all of the animals that would qualify to be owned by Jacob. He's just removed them and given them to his own children and sent them off into the desert. So now Jacob's responsible for all of his white sheep and goats, but he's been promised he personally can keep any that have this darker color to them. So then we're told this weird story about how Jacob peels a bunch of branches to show the white under the bark, and then has the animals mate in front of these peeled branches, and then they start producing the speckled, spotted, dark-colored sheep and goats. Again, I have no idea. It seems scientifically like that shouldn't be a thing, but for whatever reason, this is how God chooses to bless him. So these regular animals start producing the kinds of animals that Jacob can keep. That's really all you need to know. This is Jacob's plan. Okay, so in this way, God blesses Jacob powerfully. We're told Jacob grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. So Jacob gets rich. Remember, he showed up on the run from his brother, probably without a penny to his name. He's worked for Laban for 14 years. He still doesn't have much to show for it, except for 2 wives and a whole bunch of children, right? And now God is giving him all of these animals that are his. He's becoming wealthy. Now in Genesis 31, God told Jacob to return to Canaan, and we're told in 31:38 that Jacob has now been in Haran, where Laban lives, for 20 years. He's been gone from his home for 20 years serving his uncle. Okay, so God has told Jacob it's time to go home. So Jacob reaches out to Rachel and Leah, his two wives, and said, God has told me to go home. And they respond, this is in 31:14 through 16. They basically respond, let's go. But they said, not only has our father sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. So do whatever God has told you. I want you to sit with this for a minute. Jacob has asked his two wives to leave home, to leave their extended family, and go to an unknown land. This is a big ask, but they don't even hesitate. They're like, well, if the choice is between staying with our dad, who sold us to be married together to you, like, has created this really uncomfortable situation for us, yeah, we'll go with you. We're not staying here with him. So they don't even hesitate. Jacob loads up his possessions, starts traveling home. Meanwhile, Rachel, we're told, goes to her father's house and steals his household gods and sticks them in her saddlebags on her camel and sits on top of them. So she is not sad about leaving her dad, is basically what I want you to see. Like, these two women are not sad about leaving home. They don't have much respect for their dad, and they are okay with this process. And just to add injury to insult, Rachel's like, and I'm going to take these things with me as I'm going. She's going to hide them. So after they go about 3 days, and they didn't tell Laban, they didn't bother to tell him that they were leaving. So they just start heading out. They're about a few days into their trip. Laban finds out that his household gods are missing, his daughters are missing, all of his sheep and goats, everything's gone. And so he rallies up some family members and they head off after them. And so there's this showdown between Laban and Jacob on the journey. He accused Jacob of selling his household gods or stealing them. And Jacob says, I didn't take them, search wherever you want, see if you can find them. So Laban's looking through everything. He gets to Rachel, and she's like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm having my period right now. I can't get off my camel. I just think this is really tricky here. This is kind of sneaky. So Laban doesn't find anything, and then Laban and Jacob form a treaty together. And then the terms of their treaty is that they agree to separate and to not harm each other. I don't think you add that clause unless there's a reason you really want to harm each other. But this is the treaty that they make, and so Jacob and his family continue on to Canaan. A couple things I want you to see this morning. For the first time in his life, Jacob was deceived instead of the one being the deceiver. The result of his trickery caused a lot of pain and dysfunction for his family. That wasn't something he brought on. It's not something, a result of what he did, but it was the consequences of some of his choices. So I'm going to give you 2 questions to talk about at your tables, and then I'll bring us back together. Here are the 2 questions. How do you think it felt for Jacob to be on the receiving end of trickery and deceit? And then the second is, why do you think God preserved this story of pain and dysfunction for the people of Israel? Remember, Moses is telling this story to the Israelites some 500 years later. He's telling them their origin story, and this is the story that he tells. So why does he share this with them, and how does that impact the Israelites? So go ahead and talk about that at your tables, and then I'll circle us up in a minute. All right, you guys. I hope that you had some good conversation around your tables. There's just so much. I mean, every week I feel like I'm trying to condense 3 chapters of Genesis into a 20-minute talk, and there's just no way we do that. So we're doing our best. This morning, what I want us to see is that Jacob, he just had this amazing encounter with God where God said, I am going to go with you. I am going to be with you. And he is still in the process of learning the character and goodness of God. We saw that God repeated the covenant that he made with Abraham and Isaac. He repeated that to Jacob, and he also included these pieces of going with him. Jacob is learning what it means to follow God even when things become painful and difficult. One of the things that we talked about at our table is this idea that Jacob had been a con man almost his entire life. And it seems like when he shows up at Laban's house, like he's trying to lay that down. It seems like maybe for the first time in his life, he is trying to deal honestly with people, but in return, he's the one on the receiving end of being tricked and deceived, or treated deceitfully. And I think there's probably something in that was painful, but it's almost like God is saying, how are you going to operate? Are you going to fall back on the bad habits that have always worked for you? Or are you going to stay consistent and trust that I'm going to work this out for you? And it seems like Jacob moves forward with honesty, even though it's painful for him. Okay. Laban's deceit causes a lot of pain and dysfunction for Jacob's family. But God was still with Jacob, even in the midst of that pain. And with Leah, and with Rachel, and Zilpah, and Bilhah. And I think it's fascinating that we know all of their names, and we know the history of the pain that they went through. Leah would go on to become the mother of the priests of Israel. She became the mother of the Levite nation, the Levite tribe. So Leah, even though she was the unloved wife, she had 6 sons, one of them who would become the priestly line of Israel. The other thing that you should know is another one of her sons was Judah, who became the father of all of the royal line of Israel, including the line of Christ. So even though Leah experienced what it was like to be unloved and unwanted, that God saw her and preserved her in the sense of giving her sons that would take on important leadership roles in the life of Israel. Rachel died in childbirth on the journey back to Canaan. Remember, we left this story where they were headed back. So she'd already had Joseph. She was pregnant a second time with a son that would become Benjamin, but when she delivered him, she passed away. Leah ended up raising Rachel's children. Leah was the wife that was with Jacob the longest. When Leah died, many years later, Jacob buried her next to his parents and his grandparents. Rachel was buried on the way in the area around Bethlehem. That's where she gave birth to Benjamin. So she was buried on the journey back to Canaan. But Leah moved all the way into Canaan and then was buried along with Jacob's ancestors. And when Jacob died later, he asked to be buried in the tomb next to her. So I want you to see there are some glimmers here of hope and restoration, but in the meantime, this was a turning point for this nation. And I think part of the reason that this is the story that gets preserved is because the Israelites needed to know that their ancestors were not perfect people, and that families sometimes have pain and dysfunction. That does not disqualify you from being a faithful follower of God. So that is my main message this morning. If you have, like Jacob, if you can look back at your own family history and see moments of pain and dysfunction, that does not disqualify you from being a faithful follower of God. And in some ways, this has shaped the nation of Israel into who they become. And it reminds them that God is the hero of these stories, not the humans. It's always God. It's the character of God and the goodness of God that we rely on. We don't want to celebrate Jacob. We want to celebrate the God of Jacob, is the point. So let me pray for us, and then we'll move into a time of communion.